Appeals Court in Washington has rejected Donald Trump's claim that he is immune from prosecution on charges he sought to overturn the 2020 election. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit dismissed Trump's argument that he cannot be prosecuted for actions taken while serving in the nation's highest office. Special counsel Jack Smith says the former president's acts were criminal and could not be covered by presidential immunity. Last year, as you might remember, a federal grand jury indicted Trump on charges stemming from his alleged efforts to remain in power after losing the 2020 election. The former president has denied any wrongdoing.
Welcome, guys. Adam is here. So what's going on right now? The Supreme Court dealt Trump a massive blow, not in a close partisan split, but 6-3, with Chief Justice Roberts writing the opinion and Trump's own appointees Gorsuch and Barrett joining the majority. The ruling firmly rejected Trump's sweeping immunity claims, declaring that presidents are powerful but not above the law or constitutional accountability.
Joe, that Supreme Court ruling recognizing former President Donald Trump's immunity claim for official acts as president, though rejected it for unofficial acts. The majority opinion delivered by Chief Justice John Roberts states, while the president is not above the law, that he may not be prosecuted for exercising his core constitutional powers, and he is entitled to at least presumptive prosecution for his official acts. Still, it states that Trump is asserting a far broader immunity than the limited one we have recognized. Now, in the dissent, Justice Sonia Sotomayor countering that it makes a mockery of the principle foundational to our Constitution and system of government that no man is above the law.
The specific power claims that Trump built the central pillars of his second-term agenda on exceeded the lawful authority the Constitution and federal statutes actually confer. That is the ruling. That is the constitutional moment. And the specific combination of the 6-3 margin, the Trump appointees participating, and the Chief Justice authoring the majority opinion, that precise character of the decision is what makes it the most consequential and most permanent constitutional legacy of the entire Trump era. Stay with me, because we are about to walk through every specific documented piece of what this means today.
Good morning. I'm Major Garrett in the nation's capital. Breaking news in the case involving former President Trump's role in the January 6th insurrection. Special counsel Jack Smith charged Trump with 4 felony counts for interfering in the 2020 election. A federal appeals court here in Washington, D.C. has just ruled Trump does not have immunity. Last month, Trump's attorneys argued before a 3-judge panel that all presidents are immune from criminal prosecution for actions taken while in office unless they are first impeached and convicted by Congress. The special counsel had requested the Supreme Court issue a ruling on the former president's broad immunity claim, but that was rejected. Today's appeals court ruling will have a large impact on special counsel Smith's case against Trump, which was set to begin on March 4th, but that date is now on hold as this immunity claim moves through the court.
The ruling that most precisely fits the reign ends framing came down and struck at the fiscal foundation of everything Trump was trying to build. We are talking about a decision that invalidated Trump's sweeping global tariffs, the ones he marketed as Liberation Day tariffs. The court ruled 6-3 that those tariffs were unconstitutional.
This is one of the most significant cases that the justices have decided in recent years. Here, the Supreme Court ruling that President Trump's use of these emergency tariffs that he has implemented are illegal. It's the most significant economic case to reach the high court in years, sweeping implications for the economy and, of course, for presidential power. And at stake here are billions of dollars in revenue that have already been collected by the government. Pamela Wolf, the other significance here is that this is the first time that the 6-3 conservative court has ruled against President Trump in one of these major cases that have gone before the court since he returned to power in January. Now, we are still going through this case, but this is something we have been waiting for. The court said that it would take up this case on an expedited basis.
Chief Justice Roberts wrote the majority. Gorsuch and Barrett, 2 justices Trump personally appointed and publicly credited as part of his court, joined that majority. The legal mechanism? The major questions doctrine. That doctrine says when a president claims enormous power over something of vast economic and political significance, that power has to come from clear, specific authorization from Congress, not from vague, broad statutory language that can be stretched to mean whatever the president wants it to mean. The court found that the statutory language Congress gave the president simply did not authorize sweeping peacetime global tariffs. And here is the kicker. Approximately $160 to $165 billion in collected tariff revenue was never legally the government's to take. That is real money. That is a real ruling. It happened. It is documented by credible reporting from Reuters, Politico, NBC, and multiple other major outlets. And it fits the reign ends framing with surgical precision because it struck down the fiscal foundation of the one big, beautiful bill Trump was pushing. It exposed the government to a massive refund liability, and it was delivered by a majority that included the justices Trump has specifically and publicly claimed as his people. This demonstrated, beyond any spin, that constitutional principle matters more than personal loyalty on that court. The king's framing in the ruling is the specific constitutional language that makes this decision so permanently damaging for Trump, beyond just the immediate policy loss. When Roberts wrote the majority opinion applying the major questions doctrine, the constitutional principle he articulated was this: Congress must speak clearly before any president receives authority over matters of vast economic and political significance. That is not a principle that can be walked back or narrowed in future cases without abandoning the constitutional conservative jurisprudence the court has been building for decades. It is a precedent. A real documented 6-3 Supreme Court precedent that says specifically and on the record that presidential claims of vast authority under broad statutory language, without clear congressional delegation, exceed the constitutional limits of executive power. And as a precedent, it binds not just this ruling, but every future case where a president claims similar authority under similar statutory language. The reign ends framing captures something specifically and legally accurate about the permanent character of that precedent. The constitutional limit the ruling established is not a temporary setback in one case. It is a permanent reduction in the scope of presidential power that will constrain every president, including Trump, in every future case where the same constitutional principle applies. Are you kidding me? A Supreme Court precedent established with a 6-3 majority, including the president's own appointees, does not get reversed easily or quietly. It becomes the constitutional law of the land in ways that bind the executive branch permanently, regardless of who holds the presidency. Trump's documented public reaction to the ruling is the most specific available real-time signal of how seriously his operation assessed the constitutional damage. He publicly attacked Gorsuch and Barrett as unpatriotic. He called them disloyal to Republicans. He vowed to reimpose tariffs under a different statutory framework, even though his legal team had no clear path to do so. All of that is the predictable and documented Trump response to a ruling he assessed as genuinely catastrophic for the foundational executive power theory his second-term agenda was built on. And the specific fury directed at his own appointees, the people he personally put on the court and publicly credited as the pillars of his constitutional protection strategy, is the most specific and most emotionally revealing signal that the ruling landed as a genuine betrayal in the most personally significant sense available to him. When Trump publicly attacks his own Supreme Court appointees by name and calls them unpatriotic for ruling against him, the ruling that produced that reaction is the one that damaged his foundational strategy most completely, not a routine adverse outcome that the spin machine can absorb, a foundational constitutional damage that the entire second-term power framework was built to prevent. And that now becomes the permanent constitutional legacy of the court he reshaped with 3 appointments. The symbolic dimension of the justices he appointed joining the majority is the specific feature of the ruling that the reign ends framing most precisely captures. And it deserves careful analysis because it is the most important and most lasting political consequence of this constitutional outcome, beyond the immediate policy implications. Trump built his political brand around the Supreme Court appointments as proof of his power and his legacy. He told his supporters that the court he built would protect them and protect him. He used the appointments as a central argument for why supporting him was worth the cost, and the specific irony of the justices he appointed applying constitutional conservative principles in ways that directly and specifically limited his power. That is the most precise available demonstration that constitutional jurisprudence is not a personal loyalty mechanism. It cannot be converted into one regardless of who makes the appointments. The reign ends framing captures that specific irony with the most dramatically apt characterization available. The reign that was built in part on the promise of a loyal court ends with the court he built applying the principles it actually believes to produce the constitutional limits he feared most. That narrative symmetry is not just dramatic. It is the specific and documented constitutional reality of what the 6-3 tariff ruling with Trump's appointees in the majority actually represents as a political and historical fact. Let us really get deep into the full picture here, because there are three specific dimensions of the justices united against him story that each deserve careful treatment. The first dimension is the specific constitutional principle that the majority opinion established and why that principle, as a formal Supreme Court precedent with the 6-3 cross-ideological majority, creates the most permanent and most specifically binding constitutional limit on presidential power that the Trump era has produced. The second dimension is the cascade effect across the broader second-term agenda and what the ruling means practically for every other ambitious executive power claim that was built on the same foundational theory of broad statutory authorization as sufficient justification for vast presidential authority. And the third dimension is the broader institutional significance of the Supreme Court becoming the institution that most publicly and most permanently says no to the most ambitious power claims of the Trump presidency, and what that specific institutional role means for the constitutional order going forward. So let us start with the constitutional principle first. Understanding exactly what the major questions doctrine establishes as a permanent constitutional constraint is the foundation for everything else. The major questions doctrine holds that when the executive branch claims authority over matters of vast economic and political significance, that authority must be grounded in clear and specific congressional delegation, not in broad general statutory language that could be stretched to cover the claimed authority through ambitious interpretation. That principle was established in a series of administrative law cases before the tariff ruling, but its extension to direct presidential power claims under a statute like the one Trump used is the specific and new constitutional development that the tariff ruling most consequentially adds to the doctrine's scope. Before the tariff ruling, the major questions doctrine had been applied most forcefully to administrative agency claims of authority under broad enabling statutes. After the tariff ruling, it applies with equal force to direct presidential claims of authority under broad statutory language when the claimed authority is of vast economic and political significance. That extension is the specific and most consequential constitutional development of the entire Trump era from the perspective of permanent doctrinal impact, and the 6-3 cross-ideological majority with Trump appointees makes it the most durable and most specifically binding version of that extension available, because it reflects the genuine constitutional convictions of the most ideologically diverse majority that could plausibly have reached that conclusion. The lineage of this ruling connects back to the most important and most historically consequential tradition of Supreme Court separation of powers jurisprudence. The foundational precedent from the 1950s established that presidential emergency powers are not unlimited, and that courts have both the authority and the responsibility to review executive emergency actions against constitutional standards. The famous three-tier framework for analyzing presidential power, distinguishing between actions with congressional authorization, actions in contested zones, and actions against congressional will, has been the foundational analytical tool for every major separation of powers case since then. The tariff ruling fits precisely and specifically in the third tier of that framework, presidential action against the implicit will of Congress, where Congress never clearly authorized sweeping peacetime tariffs. That is where presidential power is at its lowest ebb and judicial scrutiny is most intense. The Roberts majority opinion placing the tariff claim in that lowest ebb zone is the specific and most precisely targeted application of that framework to the most ambitious executive power claim of Trump's second term. The constitutional lineage is decades deep. The framework is established and durable. And the 6-3 majority applying it to the tariff claim creates a precedent that is specifically supported by the most important and most historically consequential tradition of constitutional executive power jurisprudence. Now let us talk about the cascade effect across the broader second-term agenda, because this is the most practically consequential downstream dimension of the ruling. Every other ambitious Trump executive power claim that is built on the same foundational theory, broad statutory authorization as sufficient justification for vast presidential authority, is now specifically vulnerable to the same major questions, doctrine analysis that struck down the tariffs. Emergency declarations that claim vast economic authority under broad national emergency statutes, vulnerable. Executive orders that claim to restructure major federal programs based on broad enabling language, vulnerable. Immigration enforcement actions that claim sweeping authority to fundamentally reshape the immigration system under statutes that were not specifically designed to authorize that scope of action, vulnerable. All of those categories of executive action share the same constitutional vulnerability to the major questions doctrine analysis that the tariff ruling established as the applicable framework. The cascade is broad. It is not limited to trade policy. It reaches every major executive action where the claimed authority is of vast significance and the statutory authorization is broad rather than specific and clear. And the specific 6-3 majority with Trump appointees makes the principle most durable precisely because it is most difficult to attribute to partisan motivation or ideological bias. Here is another critical dimension: the lower court green light effect. When the Supreme Court establishes a constitutional principle with a 6-3 cross-ideological majority, every lower court judge in the country is on notice that the principle is durable, that it reflects the genuine constitutional convictions of the court's majority rather than a narrow or contested outcome, and that applying it consistently in their own cases is the most appropriate and most legally defensible approach available. Lower court judges who have been managing their case strategies around the uncertainty of how the Supreme Court would ultimately rule on major executive power questions now have the most authoritative possible guidance. The uncertainty that has been the most important procedural tool for managing legal challenges to ambitious executive action is eliminated, and the specific executive power claims that are most similar to the tariff claim, in their reliance on broad statutory language for vast authority, are now the most specifically and most immediately vulnerable to being struck down under the same major questions doctrine framework. The green light is comprehensive. Every lower court proceeding involving a similar executive power claim is now more likely to reach the most consequential constitutional outcome faster, because the Supreme Court has provided the most authoritative and most specifically applicable framework for exactly that analysis. The institutional role of the Supreme Court as the institution that most publicly says no to the most ambitious Trump power claims is the dimension that the reign ends framing captures most cinematically. The executive branch has been the most aggressive and most expansive source of power claims in the second term. The legislative branch has been divided between supporting and resisting those claims through the documented Republican fracture pattern we have been tracking. And the judiciary has been the most consistent and most constitutionally grounded source of resistance to the most legally vulnerable executive power claims. The tariff ruling represents the most public and the most permanent expression of that judicial resistance role because it comes from the Supreme Court rather than from lower courts, and because it reflects a cross-ideological majority rather than a partisan split. The institutional role of the Supreme Court as the primary constitutional check on the most ambitious Trump executive power claims is the most specifically important feature of the current moment for the long-term health of the constitutional order. And the fact that the court is playing that role with a majority that includes justices specifically appointed by Trump is the most powerful available demonstration that constitutional principles can constrain the very presidents who appointed the justices most committed to them. Let me bring this all the way home with 4 clear, concrete points. I want you to walk away from this video with a complete and honest understanding of why the 6-3 cross-ideological ruling is the most durable available constitutional precedent, how the Cascade effect reaches every other ambitious executive power claim built on the same foundational theory, what the institutional significance of the Supreme Court's constitutional check roll means for the balance of power, and what we need to watch as the downstream consequences continue to develop. Point 1. The 6-3 cross-ideological majority, with Trump-appointed justices joining the Roberts opinion, creates the most durable and most specifically binding version of the major questions doctrine constraint on presidential power, because it is most difficult to attribute to partisan motivation and most representative of the genuine constitutional convictions of the ideologically diverse majority that produced it. Constitutional precedents are most durable when they reflect genuine cross-ideological agreement rather than narrow partisan majorities. A 6-3 ruling with the Chief Justice writing the opinion and 2 Trump appointees joining the majority reflects exactly that kind of genuine cross-ideological constitutional agreement. It is the most specifically difficult available version of the ruling to dismiss as politically motivated, and the most specifically representative of the genuine constitutional principles that the court's majority actually believes. That durability is the most important feature of the precedent from the perspective of its long-term constitutional impact, and the specific composition of the majority is the specific feature that makes the durability most concrete and most credible. Point 2. The cascade effect of the major questions doctrine applied to direct presidential power claims reaches every other ambitious executive action built on the same broad statutory authorization theory and creates the most comprehensive available constraint on the executive power overreach pattern that has characterized the entire second-term agenda. Every executive action that claims vast authority under broad statutory language without specific, clear congressional delegation is now specifically vulnerable to the same constitutional analysis that struck down the tariffs. The scope of that vulnerability is not limited to trade policy. It reaches emergency declarations, executive orders restructuring major federal programs, and immigration enforcement actions claiming sweeping authority under broad enabling language. The cascade is comprehensive, and the specific 6-3 majority with Trump appointees makes the doctrine most durably applicable across the full range of similar executive power claims. Point 3. The institutional role of the Supreme Court as the primary constitutional check on the most ambitious Trump executive power claims is the most historically important and most constitutionally significant feature of the current moment, because it demonstrates that constitutional principles constrain the very presidents who appointed the justices most committed to them. The executive branch claims power, the legislative branch divides, and the judiciary provides the most consistent and most constitutionally grounded resistance. The Supreme Court specifically taking that role with a majority that includes Trump's own appointees is the most powerful available demonstration that constitutional jurisprudence is not a personal loyalty mechanism and cannot be converted into one, regardless of who makes the appointments. That demonstration is the most important constitutional lesson of the entire Trump era, and it is delivered in the most authoritative possible format by the most authoritative possible constitutional institution. Point 4. Here is exactly what we need to watch as the downstream consequences of the Supreme Court's constitutional check roll continue to develop. Watch the lower court proceedings involving similar executive power claims for any indication that the green light effect is producing accelerated constitutional challenge outcomes. Watch the administration's alternative authority strategy for any indication of whether the legal team has identified any statutory basis for reimposing tariff objectives that can survive the major questions doctrine analysis. Watch any future Supreme Court cases involving presidential emergency power or broad statutory authorization claims for any indication of whether the 6-3 tariff precedent is being applied consistently. and watch the broader political response to the court's constitutional check roll for any signals about whether the administration or his congressional allies are pursuing strategies to limit the court's jurisdiction or authority in ways that would undermine the constitutional check function that this ruling most specifically demonstrates. So here is the absolute bottom line, and I want you to carry all of this with you. The Supreme Court ruling striking down Trump's sweeping tariffs, with Chief Justice Roberts writing the majority opinion and Trump's own appointees Gorsuch and Barrett joining that majority, is the most consequential and most permanently binding constitutional precedent of the entire Trump era. The major questions doctrine, applied to direct presidential power claims, creates the most comprehensive available constraint on executive power overreach across every ambitious action built on broad statutory authorization, without clear congressional delegation. The Cascade effect reaches well beyond trade policy into every similar constitutional vulnerability in the second-term agenda. Trump's documented public reaction, attacking his own appointees as unpatriotic, is the most specific available real-time confirmation of how seriously the ruling damaged the foundational executive power theory his second term was built on. And the institutional role of the Supreme Court as the primary constitutional check on the most ambitious Trump power claims, delivered by a majority that includes the justices he specifically appointed and publicly claimed as his, is the most historically important and most constitutionally significant demonstration that constitutional principles constrain the very presidents who most ambitiously test their limits. The reign ends framing is not hyperbole. It is the most precisely accurate available characterization of what happens when the institution, a president built to protect his power, becomes instead the institution that permanently and most authoritatively defines the constitutional limits of that power for every president who follows. We are going to be right here watching every single development as the constitutional legacy of this ruling continues to reshape the executive power landscape. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Does this ruling permanently reshape the constitutional limits of presidential power, or does the administration find a way to rebuild the executive power framework within the new constitutional constraints the ruling established? I want to hear from you. I will see you in the next one.